If you take a classic, a true monument of literature like George Orwell's 1984, and you flip the entire narrative perspective, what do you really gain?
That's the question, isn't it?
Do you just update the warning for a new generation? Or do you risk watering down that powerful structural critique that made the original so terrifying?
That is precisely the tightrope Sandra Newman walks with Julia. A novel. It is.
Exactly.
Well, it's an audacious project. Revisiting Oceania from the perspective of Winston Smith's lover, Julia, it allows her to dig into these huge blind spots of the original text, especially around gender and survival. But it fundamentally changes how you experience that totalitarian dread.
And that's our mission today. We're going to take a deep dive into Newman's authorized retelling, analyzing not just what she changed, but how she actually built a compelling argument for this new version.
It's a fascinating rhetorical puzzle.
Now, before we jump into the Ministry of Love, let me frame our discussion just a bit. You are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book analysis.
And this whole approach is designed to give you more than just a summary, though we do include that as well.
Exactly. Enjoy a bold new take on book coverage with this extended analysis.
This feature examines how the author shapes an argument, builds influence, and earns or loses your trust, giving you the tools to read with sharper insight and greater discernment.
Should you read this book? It's also excellent for aspiring writers.
And if you find this expanded format valuable, we'd love to hear from you. Your feedback helps guide our future content.
Okay, let's get into it. A lot of these retellings, they fall flat because they lack authority.
Right.
But Newman starts with this massive structural advantage. She was explicitly invited and authorized by the Orwell estate,
Which she very publicly framed as an authorized feminist counter-narrative. That's a huge boost to her credibility, to her ethos, right out of the get.
It's the ultimate signal of legitimacy. For any skeptics out there who might worry this is just, well, unauthorized fan fiction.
That estate approval is like an inoculation. It basically buys her the trust she needs to start dismantling and reconfiguring this world we all thought we knew so well.
But I have to ask, doesn't that external authorization, being sanctioned, actually undermine the radical message of rebellion the book is trying to send?
That's a sharp point. It does remove some of that guerrilla aspect of critique, but I think she uses that foundation of trust to build her logical case, her logos. She meticulously reproduces the entire terrifying infrastructure of Oceania.
The newspeak, the pervasive surveillance.
The party hierarchy, the 2 minutes hate, all of it. By making sure that whole scaffolding is identical, she proves she respects the original warning.
So she's not contradicting Orwell's world.
No, not at all. She's extending it. She's detailing its mechanics from a new angle. Her purpose, then, isn't just to repeat Winston's plot, but to fill in the gaps around Julia.
To expose how power, surveillance, and critically, this deep-seated misogyny operate on and through a woman.
A woman who, just to survive, has to be both a pragmatic collaborator and, somehow, an internal resistor.
Which brings us to the core rhetorical shift here. Focalization. The story's entire controlling device is no longer Winston.
Right. He was this middle-aged, pretty isolated male bureaucrat whose view of the world, and especially the women in it, was inherently limited.
Distorted, even.
Absolutely. Winston saw the system from a very ideological place, and he saw Julia as a symbol, a rebel from the waist down, this abstract life force against the party's sterility.
He never really got the logistics of what it meant to be a woman surviving under Big Brother.
Exactly. And Julia flips that lens completely. We're now centered on a young woman who is an insider. She's working in the fiction department. She's navigating the awful communal living of the women's hostel.
And using her sexuality as a calculated tool. Her work life, her friendships, her sex life, all of it just peels back these gendered layers of control that Winston never even saw.
The effect is so striking. We revisit all these familiar events, the affair, the note, even Room 101, but they are completely reframed.
They're not about Winston's big ideological awakening anymore.
No, they become these incredibly complex negotiations over gendered power, over safety, and over basic physical autonomy for Julia.
And crucially, Newman gives Julia a real backstory, one that justifies her cynical pragmatism.
We learn about her family's role in the early revolution, her childhood, this early understanding of betrayal she has.
It's the causal logic for why she is so street smart and, frankly, so complicit. She gets that the system is inescapable in a way that Winston, with his sort of romantic dreams of rebellion, he never could.
For Julia, survival isn't about grand gestures. It's all micro-negotiations and deep, messy compromise.
That complexity immediately ramps up the emotional impact, the pathos. It has to.
Yeah.
It also fundamentally shifts the style away from Orwell's.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
His prose was austere, almost repertorial, concept-driven.
And Newman's tone it's just vastly different.
Yeah.
Reviewers always note how she mixes that grim structural dread with this darkly sardonic, often very sexually explicit realism.
It's a much more contemporary sensibility. It just throws Orwell's clinical distance right out the window.
And the pathos is heightened because we are always inside Julia's head. We don't just know life is hard. We experience the humiliation of the women's hostel, the constant physical discomfort.
That background hum of sexual danger, the sustained, debilitating paranoia from knowing anyone could denounce you at any moment.
It makes the political terror so deeply bodily.
It is. Newman uses this incredibly sensuous, almost aggressive language focusing on smells, textures, the feeling of threadbare clothing, the physical decay of life in Oceania. She embeds political terror in everyday sensory experience.
Which makes the party's intrusion into intimacy so much more concrete than in Orwell's version.
Well, when Orwell talked about the anti-sex doctrine, it was largely an abstraction, a tool of political control.
Right.
When Newman talks about it, we're confronting visceral sex, her affairs with party members, her own strategic use of her body, these brutal interrogations. It all makes bodily vulnerability the central political reality for women.
That physical realism is the key to her whole argument, I think. Totalitarianism has to control the body.
And Julia's survival is measured by her ability to manage that physical threat day in and day out.
This detailed psychological and stylistic analysis is a good moment to mention other resources for this kind of understanding. Remember to check out Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel offering AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques. It's all there to inspire reflection and rational thought.
Okay, so let's move to the deepest level of analysis here.
Yeah.
Agency, complicity, and this powerful term that critics have been using.
The feminist anastrophic version.
Exactly. I love that phrase.
It's perfect because that's what she does. She reverses the narrative priority.
Yeah.
1984 so often reduced its female characters to symbols. You had the party drone, the sexual rebel, the pearl mother figure.
There are projections of Winston's needs.
Yes, and Julia contests that directly by foregrounding Julia's own desires, her calculations, her profound ambivalences. She is not a symbol. She's a person.
And this is where the book so brilliantly uses irony.
Yeah.
You mentioned Winston's misogynistic dismissal of her.
Durable from the waist down.
Right. Newman takes that exact phrase, that criticism, and flips it completely on its head.
She shows that Julia's sexuality isn't some simple biological impulse. It's a high-stakes, calculated tool.
A weapon, even. We see her strategic promiscuity used for very specific purposes, to gather information, to test loyalties.
Or even to subtly further the party's aims by identifying potential dissidents for them.
It turns what was a dismissal of female sexuality into a commentary on how female autonomy, even when it's compromised, can be weaponized by and against the state's patriarchy.
And that broadening of the logical argument is so crucial. Newman is showing that totalitarianism isn't just top-down ideology. It co-opts every single mechanism of survival, every established gender norm.
Julia navigates the black markets. She plays the part of the devoted anti-sex league member, which is its own kind of theater.
And she takes on sexual assignments for party gain. The book thematizes patriarchy, not just in big state policies like ARTSEM, the Artificial Insemination Program,
but in the constant grinding personal dynamics. She is always navigating predatory men, dealing with weaponized chastity in other women, and perpetually questioning if any moment of intimacy is just elaborate informant work.
This all leads to the central tension that has dominated the reviews of this book.
The question of her resilience.
Exactly. Julia is portrayed as almost a final girl survivor. Her resilience is almost superheroic compared to the fatalistic Winston. And that individual agency is essential for the feminist retelling. But it forces a big question.
Does emphasizing that level of individual survival, this messy, partial survival, undercut Orwell's bleak structural critique?
Where the state always wins.
Yeah.
Inevitably.
Right. Orwell's book was about the crushing structural inevitability of defeat. Julia suggests there might be these little pockets of messy survival, maybe even a degree of interior freedom that can endure even after the trauma of the Ministry of Love.
And that tension is really a powerful commentary on what we, as contemporary audiences, seem to demand from dystopia now.
I think so. When the totalitarian threat feels so immediate and real in our own world, maybe we need a narrative that carves out space for agency, however compromised it might be.
We're maybe less willing than Orwell's World War II generation to just accept that the fight is unwinnable from the start.
It's a different psychological need.
So, to summarize our deep dive here, Sandra Newman's Julia largely succeeds in its mission. It reinterprets this classic dystopia for a 21st century audience through three key shifts:
A change in focalization,
an intensified sensory realism,
and overt feminist thematics. It really exposes how totalitarian power operates specifically through and on gender.
it's a complex, vibrant, and I think necessary expansion of the Orwellian universe.
It absolutely is. But let's end with this one provocative thought for you to chew on. If Julia, the ultimate pragmatist and survivor, finds a way to endure and hold on to some piece of herself in a system designed to atomize and destroy the self, what does that revelation tell us about our own era's faith in the concept of individual resilience today?
A compelling question to consider long after we wrap up.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book summary. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.